Romans readers, chapter 10. We had seen earlier in chapter 9 that Paul's heart was broken over his Jewish brothers and sisters since they didn't accept Christ. He says it again here. My heart's desire and prayer to God is that they might be saved. Now he admits that they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. They are ignorant of the righteousness of God. They do not submit to the righteousness of God. What does Paul mean by this? God had made, as we have seen a number of times, a tremendous amount of promises to the Jews under the covenant. So, if God doesn't come through on those promises, then he's not righteous. In order for God to be righteous, he's got to come through on the covenant. Paul is saying, my fellow Jews, he has. In Christ, God has said yes to all the promises. In Christ, if a Jew was waiting for a new humanity, in Christ it's yes. If a Jew was waiting for the beginning of Eden, in Christ it's yes. If a Jew was waiting for salvation from the wrath of God, in Christ it's yes. So God has proved himself righteous by sending Jesus to save us. However, they're ignorant of it, and they won't submit to it. Here he says it explicitly. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. That is the goal. The goal of the whole Old Testament was always Jesus Christ. In order to prove this, Paul now, I wrote these all out. Paul quotes extensively from the Old Testament to show that Jesus was always that which was spoken of in the Old Testament. He says, Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. This is a verse from Leviticus 18. He says, Moses writes that in the law itself, if you do the commands, you shall live. Now, in my opinion, I think you should scratch out this word but and write and. Because Paul is saying, well, you Jews could say to me, Jesus isn't in the Old Testament. We never knew about Jesus. It's unfair of God to say, well, just spring Jesus on us. And Paul's saying, no, Jesus was always in the Old Testament. If you had rightly obeyed the law, you would have lived. And then he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 30. So first, the first evidence, Moses writes about Jesus. Number one, he's in Leviticus. If you had obeyed the command, you would have lived. And righteousness is based on faith, because it says in Deuteronomy. So the righteousness that is based on faith, this isn't something new. It was in Deuteronomy. So if you were to read Deuteronomy, there's these two phrases here and here. These are not in Deuteronomy. Who will ascend into heaven? That is, descend into the abyss. This is a slightly different wording that Paul says. But Moses is saying in Deuteronomy, the way of life is right near you. God's not hiding it. So the way of life isn't up in heaven. It's not as though you could say, well, I wish I really knew God's will, because if I did, then maybe I could live. Then maybe I would live. Moses is saying, no, the way to life is right in front of you. It's in Leviticus. And the way to life is right in front of you. It's not hidden in heaven. It's not way down in the abyss. It's right in front of you. Moses said it in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and many other places in the law. And Paul is saying what that means is that Christ was always present. What Moses was talking about, what was always right in front of the people, was Christ. What the Jews were always looking for then was Jesus. So Jesus wasn't hiding in heaven. That maybe the Jews could think, well, if Jesus had come down in the Old Testament, then maybe we could have believed him. Or some deep abyss, some deep dark cave in the center of the earth. That is, man, if Christ wasn't hidden in some darkness in the Old Testament, if he had shown himself in the Old Testament, then maybe we could believe. That is to bring Christ up from the dead. Paul says, the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. This is another quote from Moses. Moses is saying the word is near you, it's in your mouth and in your heart. And Paul then is saying, hey, Moses and me, we are saying the same thing. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Me and Moses were always saying Jesus. And then he has all these other quotations to prove this. Isaiah, Joel, Isaiah again, he admits, how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? Let's say the Jews never believed in Jesus. Well, we can't really expect him to submit to him then. And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And then Paul brings in a string of Old Testament quotations to show, no, Jesus was always being preached in the Old Testament. So I ask, have they not heard? Indeed, they have. Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. Now, question, why is Paul spending so much time on the fact that God needs to come through on his promises to Israel? Why is that so important to Paul? Well, ask yourself this. The Jews screwed up. The Jews sinned. Now, if their sin meant God doesn't have to come through on the covenant, that their sin means God does not have to do this, then what else does that mean for us? Because who else is very guilty of sin? We are, Gentiles. See, if God doesn't come through on the covenant for the Jews, there's no reason to think he'll come through for it on the Gentiles. If the Jewish people sinned, and their sin negates the covenant, then we have no hope. For God to come through for the Jews means he will come through for all of us. If God comes through for the Jews, he'll come through for the Gentiles. If the Jews sinned and God doesn't come through, there's no reason to believe that God's going to come through for us Gentiles. So it's tremendously important for us as Gentiles to believe that God's going to come through on the Jews and that Jesus was preached to the Jews. Because if God doesn't come through for them, there's no reason to believe he's going to come through for us. But he has, he will, he does in Jesus. Romans chapter 11 tomorrow.